theory can take you only so far, but it can provide some frameworks for thinking. So today, I'm going to be whacking people with swords and talking about the IR theory of realism. Hello, everybody. This is Rage Quit with Travis, and I am Travis. So today we are at Nuria, another of my least favorite levels. And today I'm once again going to be doing a bit of commentary. This time regarding the international relations theory of realism. Now, I don't necessarily find IR theory to be like the most engaging subject in the world, mostly because international relations scholars, instead of writing for understanding, write in a way that is meant to impress other international relations scholars, which just does not lead to a whole lot of understanding or, advancement of their ideas outside of their own little discipline. Of course. So, I'd like to try and get some understanding by this topic because it does get brought up in discussions of, the Russian-Ukraine war, these types of things. So, I've also, for some reason, had to learn a lot about international relations theory throughout my professional career. First, I took a class about it in grad school, in undergrad, and then I went to another kind of course that I was in, and they once again taught a section on international relations, and then in graduate school, I had a whole class on international relations theory. So clearly someone has intended for me to know quite a bit about this subject. So anyway, when we talk about realism, I think it's first to understand that realism is part of a series of schools, really just three schools of IR thought. And those are realism, liberalism, and what is now known as constructivism, used to be known as idealism. So realism, at its most simple, is a very pessimistic worldview. In realism, a lot of people will say, oh, I'm not a pessimist, I'm a realist. Just talking about day-to-day life stuff, even though I think they probably really are pessimists. But realism, as an international relations theory, actually has more to do with the idea that the world is anarchic, there's no power existing over the state, and when I say state, I mean country, and that states vie for power in this kind of zero-sum game. This is different from liberalism, which is the other school of international relations thought, which has nothing to do with liberalism in the kind of American domestic politics sense. It's a completely different concept when it comes to international relations theory. And liberalism puts forward the idea that international institutions and economic ties promote peace instead of any kind of balance of power politics. So, just a very different kind of school. And then finally you have constructivism, which is this idea that, ideas, cultures, norms, values, etc., those are the driving force in international relations. In college, I actually had a roommate who wrote a constructivist-oriented paper that posited that countries that listen to Lady Gaga actually had better relations with each other than countries that didn't. And he did this by pulling up YouTube analytic data to show, which countries had the highest viewership of certain music videos, and then he was able to show that those countries that did have that relationship didn't go to war with each other. So something like the democratic peace theory that posits that democracies, or mature democracies, don't go to war with each other. So this is like the Lady Gaga peace theory. So we have then the three main schools, with liberalism or realism rather, being just one of those. So the tenets of realism follow these 5 kind of assumptions that color the way that realists think. And the first one is that the world is anarchic. Now, that's not to say that the world is chaotic. It simply means that there is no power above the state. There is no government above governments. Rather, there is, it's essentially the international system is like a schoolyard without any teachers. There is, if a country, say Russia, wants to invade Ukraine, there's no power that can simply say, don't do that, and force them to stop. That's different from another country threatening them or saying, don't do that or else, right? Which is a different concept that's known as compellence. But rather, it's the idea that just the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, and nobody can really do anything about that. And I think that's a pretty valid assumption based off the state of the world, but that is key to the realist understanding of the world. My team is just getting mashed up here. The second is that states have an offensive military capability, what Thomas Schelling, the deterrence scholar, would call the power to hurt. And this, of course, colors how other states interact with each other in the international system. The third assumption is that states can never know what other states want to do, so that states exist in a kind of... The state itself is a black box, right? Like, you don't know what's going on inside the state, and thus you can never truly know its intentions unless you're within the state. And this is, again, I think a very fair assumption. It's what a lot of our intelligence agencies exist to do, is find out, what the intentions of foreign governments are. So, again, that is the third assumption. The fourth is that survival is the basic motive of all states. Is fair. And then the fifth is that states are rational actors even if they sometimes miscalculate. And again, somebody might point to a country like North Korea and say, oh, they're not rational actors. They're, Kim Jong-un is insane, and they don't act rationally, so that's not a valid assumption. But I would challenge people to actually think, just because someone's methods seem brutal, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are being irrational. When Kim Jong-un has his brother, assassinated in an airport, that might seem crazy to us because it's not the way that most people behave. Most, state world leaders behave. But it wouldn't be out of place in, say, the medieval era, for instance, where people did all kinds of terrible things to their political rivals. So we treat states as rational actors, which also has a big part to play in deterrence theory. It ends up being a big part of that. So those are the 5 different assumptions behind the realist school of international relations. The world is anarchic. States can hurt each other. States never know what other states want to do. Survival is the basic motive of all states. And then lastly, that states are rational actors. And realists posit that these assumptions result in three different behaviors. The first is a state of fear between states. Thucydides, in the history of the Peloponnesian War, stated that states act out of three motivations, and those are fear, honor, and interest. So fear is a very present situation between the states due to the fact that all states have the power to hurt, and states never know what other states want to do. The second behavior that this results in is that states have to provide for their own survival. The belief is because all states are acting in their own self-interest, individual states can't expect that other states will come to their aid in the event of an invasion or something. Again, look at Ukraine. They're basically on their, even though they have lots of supporters, the actual fighting is being done by the Ukrainians. And they haven't had anyone, come to their aid with actual, fighting forces. And because states have to provide for their own survival, that's why they, do make military buildups. They augment their own security forces. And this in turn leads to the one of the problems of realism, which is that states, when one state, this is called the security dilemma, when one state increases its offensive capability, its military capability, then the states around it will feel threatened, and then they will build up their military capability, and it creates this kind of cycle of fear. And the third behavior that the assumptions of realism result in is that states aim to maximize their relative power for exactly the reason that I was just talking about in the security dilemma. If you don't know what your neighbors are doing, you have to provide for your own survival, and you can't rely on anybody to intervene on your behalf, then you not necessarily have to maximize your power relative to those of your enemies. Some of the ways this is done is by bandwagoning and balancing, where countries join together in alliances to basically ensure their own survival, or they join together to be out of fear of another country gathering too much power. And so those are, I think, a good summary, a short summary of how realists think about the world. But that's all just theory, and I think it's important to note what theory can do and what theory is incapable of doing. I think theory gives us a framework for how to think about the world. It gives us common terms, definitions, a common language, so that we can communicate with each other in a way that everybody understands, is on the same page. But at the same time, some people take theory, international relations theory, and then they try to use it to see what states should do. Kind of a normative approach rather than just providing a way of thinking about the world. And I think that is a mistake, because even though I think the tenets or the assumptions behind realism are perfectly valid, there are other things at play besides naked interests. And that's the the liberal institutionalism critique of realism would be, well, that realism doesn't take into account the benefits that states can give to each other through cooperation and international organizations or economic ties. You'll hear a lot of people, talking about the possibility of war with China, and they say, "Oh, that couldn't happen or that won't happen because it would economically be disastrous because we have too many economic ties." And I think again, that is a valid kind of argument, but for every argument that international relations scholars make, there is some sort of counter argument in history. Like World War I ruined many countries' economies. All those countries were economically linked, and it didn't prevent war. And the reason that I get so frustrated with these big famous realists like John J. Mearsheimer is they take exactly that tack that and use realism to try and define exactly what states should do. And it leads to statements like, oh, well, the United States has to respect Russia's security concerns. And that actually, I think, clashes with the tenets of realism. If a country should only be concerned with its own self-interest, then it doesn't really make sense that we would have to care about the interests of other countries. We should seek to understand them because it's useful to do so. So understanding them is good. Knowing what they are so that you know how a country might react to any given event is important. But respecting them? No, I don't think the United States has to respect the interests of any country except those of the United States. And even then, there are mitigating circumstances because, for better or worse, we are a democracy, a constitutional republic, and thus the people have a vote. So even if something is not necessarily in our interest, pure interest from an economic or security standpoint, that is not the only consideration we have to make, because the people of the United States may think we should intervene in some event for moral reasons or humanitarian reasons. So there are those considerations that must be made as well. So anyway, that is the kind of down and dirty of realism. What are these guys doing back here? I think, and I'll say one more thing about national interests. I think we would probably do well to make sure that people really understood what the national interests of the United States are. And I think a useful framework for thinking about that is what's been stated by each presidential administration in the national security strategies that each administration publishes. Because in most of them, there's a spot where they have to say what the interests of the United States are. And for the most part, throughout the years, they have settled on about four specific interests. And those are the security of the American people and its allies, the economic well-being of the country, the stability of the international order, which can be an episode in and of itself, and then the promotion of American values. So those are at least what we say our interests are. And I think, that's a decent list to consider, when we're asking, hey, should that's where I think a normative approach can be taken, where you can ask, should America do X or Y? And if you're going to base it off our interests, using that framework and being able to succinctly describe what our interests are is very useful. Now I will turn back my focus to this match. I'm using my Schlappenheimer build because I'm talking about theory. And so I got this Zweihander. Two javelins. And then I've got a firebomb, I think for obvious reasons. I don't have barely any armor on, which is getting me killed a lot. The rest of this video was not really the best, so that's it for now. We're going to finish this with a kill compilation. Thanks for watching, people. Please like and subscribe.